Hello. I want to talk about something that's close to my heart in the sense of Mary pondered all these things in her heart, which she did when she believed something but didn't understand it and wanted to ponder it. And close to my heart are two gardens, Eden and Gethsemane. Both are pivotal in our relationship with God. In both these passages, when the people come out of the garden, our relationship with God has fundamentally changed. A quick summary would be Adam and Eve disobey God, and as a result, they're evicted from the garden. Whilst in Gethsemane, Jesus obeys God, and as a result, he dies on the cross. This summary, this brief reading, leads to the interpretations I grew up with, that Adam and Eve were responsible for bringing sin into the world and that Jesus paid the penalty for that. But that's always troubled me, and it's troubled many others as well, because it's hard to square an all-loving, merciful God with a God who reacts so strongly to a first offence and who wills the death of his son as the price to pay for it. So I'd like to wander into the gardens, to spend some time there, to ponder, which means to weigh up the story of Eden, to ask what truths the story of Adam and Eve reveals, and to ask, was it really God's will that his son should die on the cross? So let's join Adam and Eve in the garden, where everything is in harmony. Now, that's not to say they were living in paradise where everything's perfect. They're not living a permanent, all-inclusive, eat as much as you like holiday. Paradise is the Greek translation of garden. And it says in chapter 2 of Genesis that God took the man and settled him in the Garden of Eden to cultivate and take care of it. And we're also told that Eden is in the east, so it's not covering the whole of the world. And God also said, be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth and subdue it, meaning be stewards, tend the earth. So we're at the beginning of our history and everything's set up. Then the snake appears. It's described as the most subtle of all the wild animals. So there's obviously other animals that are subtle as well. It's actually quite a bit later in the Book of Wisdom that the snake becomes directly associated with the devil. But here, whether the authors are linking it with the devil or not, they may well be, but it's used to symbolize desire, something that's very much part of being human. I think there's a really clever bit of subtlety in the way the snake unsettles Eve by getting her to focus on something she can't have before giving her very good reasons why she should have it. He misquotes the rules when he says, did God say you can't eat from any of the trees? And that brings Eve's answer, oh no, you see all these trees, hundreds of them, we can help ourselves to any of them. There's only one in the middle that we can't have, but there's a good reason for that. If we even touch it, we die. So now she's focused on what she can't have, the snake can get to work. But before I go on, there's an important question here. And I want to ask you the question, and I have to take your first answer, the first answer that comes into your mind. What was the tree? Based on the number of times I've asked this, and on what I thought for many years, many of you will probably have thought apple. I think we've been influenced a little too much by the artist's depiction of Eve taking a bite of an apple. And if you Google Adam and Eve images, all of them have an apple. And this matters because why would God pick a tree which is perfectly good and say you can't have that? Again, the reason I grew up with, and the answer I've and virtually always given by pupils and by parents in catechesis groups, almost always they say God was testing Adam and Eve's obedience. No other reason, just I'll see if they'll do as they're told. And when they break the rule, does God come out of it well when he says, out you go, along with all the other painful punishments that he describes? Adam and Eve have everything they want, lots of other trees to eat from. So it isn't really a problem, but now that Eve is focused on it, she still isn't too attracted because she thinks she'll die even if she touches it. In other words, fear keeps her from going against God's rule. The fruit they mustn't eat is the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And that's a far better fruit than an apple for the snake to work with. He tells her, you won't die. I'll tell you why he told you to keep away. It's because your eyes will be opened and you'll become like gods, knowing good and evil. And he's telling the truth. Adam and Eve don't die when they eat the fruit. But what the snake's done is he's picked up on Eve's misquoting of God, who didn't say you'll die. He said you'll be doomed to die. It's a bit like me saying to someone, don't touch crack cocaine, you'll die. They probably won't straight away, but very likely they'll be on the road to death. God warns Adam and Eve that if they eat the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, they will definitely be on this road. The snake was also telling the truth when he says, they'll become like gods. To have knowledge of good and evil means to know what good and evil is. And that's not just knowing the rules. It's understanding how something is good and how it is evil right at the core. We're not talking about good and bad behavior here, but what is fundamentally good and what is fundamentally evil. And to have that breadth and depth of knowledge, to be able to decide what's fundamentally good and fundamentally evil, you have to be a god. And the snake promises this when he says, your eyes will be opened. You'll see, as in you'll understand. Now, I have to give it to the snake. That is top class subtlety. The temptation isn't to do anything bad. Surely it's good to have that knowledge, to be able to decide what's good and what's evil. And anyway, didn't God make us in his image? Aren't we supposed to be like gods? I'm sure these are the issues the authors of Genesis were grappling with, how we as humans can grow into the image of God as he intended, and how we fail to do that. So going back to the story, Eve looks at the tree and sees that it's good to eat. Its fruit wasn't poisonous. It's pleasing to the eye. Well, surely that means it must be good, doesn't it? I mean, we humans aren't stupid. We can recognize it evil when we see it. And this fruit looks good. And the wisdom it would give her is certainly attractive. And anyway, why shouldn't we be wise? Surely that's a good thing. So all things considered, it seems the snake has given her some good advice. So she eats it. And let's assume she's a good and loving wife. She wants to share with hubby, so she offers him some. And then things change. The snake was right about their eyes being opened. It says the eyes of both of them were opened and they realized they were naked. Just an aside here to illustrate how I think we should read the story. And I often use this point to suggest that it's clear we're not meant to take it literally. We don't know how long Adam and Eve have been in the garden, but it's obviously for a good while. And for a man to walk around for weeks or months and only then notice the woman he's with is naked, sorry, not a chance. Clearly something has happened here, something very significant. Just before the snake came on the scene, it says both of them were naked, the man and his wife, but they felt no shame. That's right at the end of chapter 2. So they were naked before and they're naked after. What's changed is their perception of themselves and of each other. Their eyes have been opened, but they aren't like God's. What was perfectly okay before, they were naked and God saw that it was good, and so did they, is now a problem. They're now ashamed and they cover themselves. This doesn't mean that there's anything wrong with the human body or with sex. To draw that conclusion would be to say God made something dodgy, something that wasn't good. In covering themselves with fig leaves, they're hiding from each other, either because they're ashamed of who they are, they're no longer at ease with themselves, or because of the way they look at the way they're looked at by each other. Eve doesn't like the way Adam looks at her now, so has to put a barrier between her and him. The same goes for the way Eve looks at Adam. It's a difference between being at ease with yourself and being admired and accepted, even loved, for who you are, or being lusted after for what use you can be. Notice, by the way, that God isn't on the scene yet. The change has already happened, and now God arrives, coming for what we assume is his customary evening walk and looking for his friends. Now, we know that God knows everything, but it's important to keep to the narrative to discover the truths the authors are drawing out. God doesn't know yet about the tree, and he is surprised at Adam's explanation for hiding. Adam doesn't say, because I was scared of what you'd do to us. He says, I hid because I was naked. Again, he was naked before, and it wasn't a problem. But now Adam's perception of God has changed. Just as Adam and Eve became uncomfortable in front of each other, so now Adam is uncomfortable in front of God. God's answer, who told you you were naked, is very important. It shows that God hasn't been sitting on high, keeping an eye on these two, looking to see if they break the rule. He's saying, I haven't said anything about you being naked, so who told you it was a problem? And his question, have you eaten from the tree, seems to me very like a parent coming home to find their teenage children slurring the words and being giddy, and the parent asking, have you been at the drinks cupboard? God recognizes the consequences. I grew up with the idea that God was really angry with Adam and Eve and that he punished them harshly for being disobedient. But now I think God is deeply distressed. He doesn't come crashing in with a guilty verdict and say, you've been eating from that tree, now you're in for it, you little so-and-so. He says, have you been eating from the tree? And I think he would say this with sadness and deep distress. I'm sure some people would accuse me of putting my own interpretation on the Bible, of avoiding some harsh truths and turning God into something I can handle. And they would seem to have a case when God tells them what's going to happen. And I'll come to that shortly. But first we have to look at how Adam and Eve respond. It's with the blame game. If we read it too casually, it becomes a simple Adam blames Eve and Eve passes the blame on to the snake. But reading casually once again skips over some important truths and difficult questions. I once taught a wonderful class of 12 to 13-year-olds and was using this story to get them to look closely and to use all of the story so that they could learn how to read the Bible. I gave them a few minutes to answer the question, who was to blame? And after a few minutes chatting, they said, Adam. pretty much all of the groups came back with the same answer: Adam, Eve, the snake, and God, which meant they'd read the story well, because they picked up that Adam didn't say, "She made me do it." He said, "It was the woman you put me with." So that's Eve and God. And Eve was a little more honest in saying, "I was tempted," but it was generally felt she didn't have to give in. She had free will. So she had to share the blame with the snake, who, the pupils pointed out, had been put in the garden by God. At this point, they still thought the tree was an apple tree, so they gave God a huge share of the blame for putting something tempting there, especially as, they told me, he knows everything, so he knew they would eat the fruit. I have to admit, I kept checking my watch at this point, because if the bell went and we were still at this stage, they'd have gone out with a very dim view of God. Although I'm not sure it would be any worse than the one they'd come in with. But there was still plenty of time. There was a lively discussion about how the blame should be apportioned between all of the characters. And I noticed one lad sitting very patiently with his hand up. And this put me on alert, because he wouldn't normally do that. And there was this certain air of confidence that made me think, what's coming now? He was quite definitive in his answer. It was everybody apart from Adam. Just before he discovered that hell hath no fury, like a group of teenage girls being told by a lad, "It wasn't me," I managed to give him a bit of space to explain. What I actually said was, "You're on your own here, and you'll have to talk fast." He said, "God put the tree there, and he made the snake. The snake knew he was lying when he talked to Eve, and Eve had free will, so she didn't have to eat it." And then he sat back, looking very pleased, and he stopped there. Several of the girls beat me to it and said, "Adam had free will as well." The lad, who I have to admit was very cool under fire, said, "Yeah, but Eve was his wife and he loved her. So he didn't want to hurt her feelings by rejecting her present, and he didn't want to leave her on her own when she was in trouble." I think I'd like to have him defending me if I ever end up in court. Anyway, back to the story, which now focuses on God's reaction. First of all, the snake. I don't think we're meant to assume the snake only started to slither on the ground at this point. The main point is there will be enmity between it and humans. The fact that it was the one who was so keen to destroy the harmony rebounded on it by making it the one most hated. Its disordered desire to create division divided it from other animals and from humans. When God turns to Eve and says, "I shall give you intense pain in childbirth. You will yearn for your husband and he will dominate you." This sounds like childbearing before was painless, but looking at the two punishments together suggests something else. Her relationship with her own body and with her husband, which were previously fine, are now a struggle. Similarly with Adam and his role in tending the earth, where before there was harmony, there's now struggle. To say that God brought in pain and hardship is like me going to a doctor with a bad cough and coming away saying, "He was really annoyed with me for smoking so much. He gave me cancer." God is pointing out the consequences of Adam and Eve taking them to themselves the authority to decide good and evil. And because they were out of the depth, they couldn't handle it. And it's not something God can fix. Adam and Eve's eyes have been opened and they see things in a distorted way. God can't close their eyes again. So then God expels them from the garden, But again, it's very clear when you read closely, he wasn't kicking them out as a punishment. It's for their own protection. He says, now they've become like us, knowing good and evil. They mustn't be able to eat the fruit of the tree of life as well, to eat and live forever. Eating from the first tree, the tree of knowledge of good and evil, meant they gave themselves the power to decide what is good and evil. And they were clearly out of their depth on that one. Eating from this second tree would mean taking to themselves the powers of life and death, the powers behind the universe. Or perhaps it would make them immortal, and it would mean they would stay forever in their mortal state. This reading of God excluding humans from the garden in their own interests to protect us from the consequences of not obeying him is very different from the reading I have spent so much of my life with, that he kicked them out as a punishment, and that for good measure he introduced pain in childbirth and made Adam's job as a farmer so much more difficult. The point the authors of Genesis were making was that by not obeying God's will, by not living in harmony with his ways, disharmony and suffering result. God wasn't inflicting punishment, he was pointing out the self-inflicted consequences. It really comes down to the importance of obeying God. Obedience sometimes has a negative connotation. It's often being used in the sense of obey the rules or else. Or it can be associated with being subservient or surrendering the freedom to live your own life. I can understand why many people don't want the bride to include honour and obey in the wedding vows. I've often been told by people, I don't want to obey God, I want to live my own life. But the problem comes largely from the fact that obey and obedience have changed their meaning over time. It comes from two Latin words, ob and audire, which means listen. So in the case of Adam and Eve, they obeyed, they listened to the snake rather than God. If they'd listened to God, they would have had more freedom, more fulfilled lives. Disobeying was destructive. I think with that understanding, it's now time to go into the other garden with the experience of Adam and Eve in mind, especially as there's one small but significant part of the story I haven't covered. When God was dealing with the snake, he said there would be enmity, a continuous struggle between its offspring and Eve's offspring. And it says of Eve's offspring, it will bruise your head and you will strike its heel. Or to put it another way, Eve's offspring will crush the snake's offspring. Some translations have he will bruise your head, and others have she will bruise your head. Both point to the Messiah. We can interpret it either as Mary or as Jesus. You might have noticed many of the statues of Mary have her standing on a snake, and this is the reason. In Gethsemane, there's no snake, but there's certainly temptation, and it's very subtle, it's very persuasive. It's worth remembering that after the devil had failed to tempt Jesus in the desert, to rely on himself rather than trusting God, and to do things his way, not God's, it says, the devil left him to return at the opportune moment. And what better time to put some doubts and some alternatives to Jesus than in this moment of crisis in Gethsemane? It reads like a mirror image of Eden, where Adam and Eve were tempted towards something inherently good, but God said, stay away, whereas Jesus is tempted to go away from something that seems inherently bad, the cross, but God says, stay. 3 times Jesus prays, he begs for some other way. So we shouldn't have any doubt that he went through a real struggle. And I think the struggle was on different levels. There was, of course, the sheer terror of the cross, and Jesus had seen enough crucifixions to know the horror that lay ahead. The gospel writers speak of his terror while he's praying, but they also speak of his anguish. And we often refer to this as Jesus' agony in the garden. His prayer, if it's possible, let this cup pass me by, is asking God for alternatives. He's agonizing over the right way to go, but he will listen to God. He will obey God's will. The crucial point then is, was it really God's will that Jesus should die? And why would he want that? The answer I had for years, to pay for our sins, seems totally the wrong attitude for an all-loving, all-merciful God to have. And with Eden in mind, I don't think the answer to the question is yes. God did want Jesus to die. I think the answer becomes, if that's what it takes. Jesus' main role as Messiah was to establish God's kingdom. It was in his first statement, repent, the kingdom of God is close at hand. And in the meal he'd celebrated with his apostles, he knew the decisive moment had come. Remember, we call this the Last Supper, but it was a Passover meal, a celebration of God liberating his people from slavery to live in the covenant as his people. Now, at the meal, Jesus said, "This is the blood of the new covenant." And he also said he wouldn't drink wine again until he drank it in the kingdom. So this is a huge responsibility, to be a turning point in human history, especially if the way forward isn't clear, or rather, if the way forward seems clear but doesn't make sense. The prayer he says in this moment of crisis draws on the words of the prayer he taught his apostles. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done. He's linking the two of them, obviously, and it emphasizes that what faces him is crucial to the bringing in of God's kingdom on earth. I think the agonizing he went through during his 3 desperate prayer sessions was trying to listen to God's answer to, if it's possible, can this cup pass me by, amongst the voices saying, don't drink this cup. Where the voices were saying to Adam and Eve, it's good, it won't harm you, it'll take you forward. The voices say to Jesus, it's bad, it'll make you fail, you'll die, and that'll be the end of your mission. This agonizing wasn't just about the physical agony. Also in Jesus' mind was that the cross was an instrument of shame in the eyes of his enemies, in the eyes of his followers, even in the eyes of his close friends. They'd shown they simply didn't understand his predictions that it would all come to this. In the eyes of everybody, his death would be seen as failure. He would have let them all down. All their expectations of what he would do as Messiah would be shattered. And the 2 disciples walking to Emmaus on Sunday morning say exactly this. So what if he was wrong? What if he was letting God down as well? Because how could this be the route to success? I might be guilty of imposing my own way of thinking on Jesus, but in his anguish and fear, could he be 100% certain of the resurrection? At this moment, the previous certainties would surely become uncertain for Jesus, whose human nature is very evident here. The subtle voice that said to Eve, no, you won't die, now says to Jesus, no, you will die. So Jesus' prayer, Father, if it's possible, let this cup pass me by, isn't simply I don't want to die, nor is it Jesus avoiding his mission as Messiah. He's saying, is there another way to fulfill my mission? I can think of one way, and I'm sure if I'm able to think of it, it will certainly have crossed Jesus' mind. He could slip out through the olive trees, down the Kedron Valley, and make his way back to Galilee, back to where people listened to him. He could lie low, regroup, rebuild, and come back to Jerusalem for another try, but this time be better prepared, a bit more streetwise, come in on a horse, not a donkey, give the people what they expect, get his followers to be tougher, not wash feet. All of that's perfectly possible, and no doubt tempting, because it would work to an extent. The end of being the Messiah and ruling could certainly in the short term still be achieved. That's what would have made it tempting. But that would be going it alone. Jesus' prayer in Gethsemane isn't the desperate prayer of someone who knows the net's closing in and asking God, his Father, can you fix things for me? Jesus is in control. He doesn't have to stay. And he chooses to listen to the voice of God, to obey God's will, not his own. And it was because he went deep into the prayer. 3 times he struggles in his 3 deep and anguished prayer sessions. And it's because of that struggle, he kept listening to God's voice. I don't have the theology to explain how it worked. That will take at least the whole of the Easter season to ponder. But I do know that his death and resurrection enabled his risen presence to be amongst us today. I think Gethsemane can't be separated from Calvary. By then, he had no choice. And seeing it in the light of Eden, it allows me to confidently listen to God. Not the God who says, listen to me or else, and makes an arbitrary rule and inflicts punishment down through the ages until someone pays him his price. But the God who says, listen to me, I've got such plans and I want you with me. Our limited horizons and our small-mindedness and fears put Jesus on the cross because we rejected the new relationship on offer. His listening to God opened up new horizons for us in the new relationship.